We're going to use this drawing to understand how the white matter of the spinal cord works. First, recall that the white matter is composed of myelinated axons. That white matter is due to the fatty material that makes up myelin. So these white matter areas are divided up into specific tracts. A tract, if you recall, is a bundle of axons typically leading to the same destination. And this way, all the upgoing or ascending and descending impulses are organized in a fashion that the information gets to where it needs to be going. So we're going to first look at what's called the ascending sensory tracts, shown here in blue, and then we'll look at some of the motor tracts shown in red. First of all, note that not all the sensory is on one side and the motor's on the other side. So these blue sensory tracts are also on this other side, and these red motor tracts are also over here on the other side. So they just tried to keep it a little cleaner by separating the sensory from the motor. But basically what these sensory tracts are specific groups of neurons leading to the same destination. So one example is this entire posterior column is an ascending sensory tract. But it specifically deals with the senses of fine touch, vibration, two-point discrimination, and conscious proprioception. Fine touch, as you can imagine, is your ability to touch an object and really interpret what it is. Vibrations are vibrations. Two-point discrimination is very similar to fine touch, a very precise sense of touch. And then proprioception is body positioning. So you can consciously know where your arms are relative to your body, where your legs are. That's a type of sense as well. So those senses all travel up to the brain in this posterior column. Another one I feel is very interesting is called the Spinothalamic Tracks. And the Spinothalamic tract is telling you where this information is going. It's going up the spinal cord, so it starts with spino, and its destination is an area in the brain called the thalamus. So it's a spinothalamic tract. The thalamus, we haven't learned about it yet, is an area of the brain that gets a lot of sensory information. But its job isn't necessarily to interpret that information, it's to relay it to other areas of the brain for interpretation. So the thalamus is often called the grand relay center. But the kind of information going up the spinothalamic tract, shown right here, is vague touch, pain, and temperature. Pain is an interesting one that we use as a good example. So if you were to touch something painful, those nociceptors or nociceptic neurons are going to fire. They're going to transmit their nerve impulses into the spinal cord. Those new impulses will actually have to cross over to the other side, so there would be a spinothalamic tract over here, and then go up to the thalamus, and then the thalamus relays that to the area of the brain that interprets that as pain. So notice point number 2 here is the pathway decussates at the level of the spinal cord rather than up in the brain. So this means that if the stimulus is on this side, so this would be the right side, and let's say you cut your right finger, that pain information comes in this way, because this is the dorsal root where sensory neurons come in. It decussates across to this spinothalamic tract on the opposite side of the spinal cord, so this would be the left side, and then it transmits up to the left side of the brain for interpretation. So that's the spinothalamic tract. The third one I like to talk about is the spinocerebellar tracts. This is going to a different part of the brain. It's going to the cerebellum. Cerebellum is extremely important for getting a lot of our proprioception. Again, proprioception is body positioning, but this is more of an unconscious proprioception. It gets information from what's called Golgi tendon organs. That's pretty fancy. We'll probably won't even talk about those, but there's sensors in your tendons, and then there's sensors in your muscles called muscle spindles. And that tells us where our body position is unconsciously, but it helps us balance. Our cerebellum does a lot for us when we're trying to balance and position the body very precisely. This is an ipsilateral track, so it doesn't cross over to the other side. It stays on the same side. So what these all have in common is they're ascending sensory tracts. We've mapped them out. We know exactly where these things are in the white matter of the spinal cord. And they're involved in transmitting specific senses to specific destinations in the brain. The motor tracts are just the opposite. The nerve impulses are not coming up the spinal cord, they're going down the spinal cord. So their origination is somewhere in the brain. So notice these, the corticospinal tracts. The second half of the word is spinal. The first half has to do with the area of the brain. Cortico refers to the cerebral cortex. And one major function of that cerebral cortex is to send somatic motor neuron impulses down the spinal cord. Then they cross over actually before they go down the spinal cord. And then out to a skeletal muscle. So somatic motor neurons originate in the precentral gyrus. That's an area of the cerebral cortex. They travel down the brainstem, then they decussate at the medulla oblongata to the opposite side, go down the spinal cord in the corticospinal tract, this tract right here, and then eventually out the spinal nerve to the muscle that it's controlling. There's also other motor tracts we're not going to get too much into, but notice that each of these motor tracts, the reticulospinal and vestibulospinal, the second part of the word is spinal, the first part is some part of the brain or some function of the brain. So we know at least it's a motor tract. The reticulospinal controls your posture. Vestibular tract helps control balance of the body and head. But these are all motor tracts. They are descending down from the brain and then going out the spinal cord to their effector organs. The next video we're going to get into now are the peripheral nerves that are attached to the CNS.